Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I would like to continue my close reading of Slavoj Žižek's book Surplus Enjoyment, A Guide for the Non-Perplexed, by focusing on a seemingly simple and yet highly important question, namely, how can you stop wasting your life? How can you be more happy and fulfilled? And Slavoj Žižek's basic argument, although he doesn't put it in those simple terms, is that psychoanalysis contains the formula or the secret when it comes to leading a better, more fulfilled life. And so what I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes or so is give you a step-by-step explanation of Slavoj Žižek's argument and how it works. Thank you for everybody who's watching, and thank you especially to the patrons who allow me to keep making these philosophical videos. If you'd like to download my complete guide to Žižek ebook, please consider becoming a patron. Okay, so let's begin. Žižek's basic argument is that we live in a permissive society, a society in which access to things that make us feel good is easier than ever before. Like, you can go on the internet and watch anything you want. Technically, when you're in school, they tell you that you could do anything you want once you grow up, etc. We have more freedom than ever before, and yet at the same time, we are less happy. We are more depressed than ever before. Žižek's basic argument, therefore, is that permissive societies kill enjoyment and happiness. The more nominally free a society is, the more depressed we are. In fact, his basic formula is that the opposite of oppression is depression. Now, in order to understand that, it's important to note that Slavoj Žižek is making a Freudian Lacanian argument about enjoyment, which is to say that for Freud and Lacan both, enjoyment is something that emerges only against the backdrop of prohibition, of an authority that tells you that you should not want it, that you should not desire it. Therefore, for Slavoj Žižek, the easiest way to stop enjoying something is to already have it. At that point, it becomes symbolically void. Instead, what's pleasurable is the journey towards it. It's the overcoming of the barrier or the obstacle that stands in between you and the object of your desire. Within a permissive society, this barrier or obstacle is removed. Therefore, it is easier to become happy nominally, and yet you remain repressed, you remain unsatisfied, you may remain depressed, as it were. Now, in order to properly understand Žižek's argument, it can be really helpful to understand the difference between the ideal ego, the ego ideal, and the superego. So the ideal ego is basically the idealized self-image that you have of yourself, how you would like to be, how you would like to imagine yourself to be, and perhaps more importantly, how you would like other people to perceive you. This is the ideal ego, which Lacan places on the level of the imaginary. It's an imaginary image of yourself, an ideal of sorts. This is contrasted with the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is the agency that you try to impress with your ego image. In other words, the ego ideal is the symbolic framework, the big other, against which you stage your ideal ego. You are trying to create an image of yourself to impress this symbolic horizon. For example, if you buy an expensive car, you're not trying to impress anyone in particular. You're trying to signal that you are somebody who can buy an expensive car. Therefore, the symbolic horizon against which your ideal ego is sustained is the ego ideal. It's a dialectical interrelationship. Now, the superego is the inverse of the ego ideal to the extent that it is the punitive dimension of the ego ideal, which is to say, the more you feed into the superego, namely, the more you try to impress other people by means of buying expensive luxury goods, the more you're actually likely to be unhappy, to be dissatisfied. And so you start buying more and even more expensive luxury goods, thereby feeding your superego, but at the same time becoming more and more unhappy. In fact, when people say that money doesn't buy happiness, they don't mean that money doesn't allow you to buy things that make you happy in the moment. What money doesn't buy is satisfaction, which is to say that the more money you have, the more you can feed your superego, the less likely you are to become content. Now, what's really important here, even though it's quite technical, is that from a Lacanian point of view, the superego isn't simply your conscience. It's not simply the devil on one shoulder versus the angel on the other telling you the right thing to do. Instead, for Lacan, and this is really crucial, the superego even though it causes you pain, even though it's what makes you feel unsatisfied, is nevertheless the very thing that allows you to experience enjoyment in the first place. Which is to say, the superego is not imposed upon the subject imposes the superego upon itself. This means that the subject is, as Žižek puts it, constitutively divided in itself. Its psychic intimacy exists only if there is a big other, a space alienated from the subject to which it relates. Which is to say, the more you give, the more you feed the superego, the less likely you are to be happy. And yet it is only against the backdrop of the superego that enjoyment emerges in the first place. And so we are stuck in a deadlock. We are stuck trying to satisfy something that can never be filled, a hole that only becomes bigger. Now, it's important to note here, to make it a little bit simpler for a moment, that Žižek's basic position is that we're all stuck in this deadlock. On the one hand, we want to be narcissistic. We want to be selfish. We want to do things that make us feel good. And yet, when we're completely left to our own devices and we have access to everything that's supposed to make us happy, we nevertheless remain unhappy. But the flip side of this, which is to completely make ourselves subject to the other, to do everything to make other people happy, to exist only so as to serve, also makes us unhappy. It also leaves us unfulfilled. And so we're stuck between the inclination towards being selfish, which we want to do to make us feel good, versus the inclination to be radically subject to others, to empty ourselves out completely for and on behalf of the other. And Žižek says this is where we exist in our current ideological stance, which is to say that within a capitalist society, the imperative is to be selfish, hedonistic, which is to say, after the death of God, after the post-ideological turn, the question is, what is life for? And the answer is, life is there so that you can enjoy yourself. In other words, the highest point of existence is for you to serve your own pleasure. But this, which is supposed to bring the subject joy, actually becomes an existential predicament. How are you supposed to be happy? How are you supposed to enjoy yourself? If life is simply the neutral backdrop against which you are supposed to maximize or enhance your enjoyment, an enjoyment which is now an ethical obligation, then this becomes its own punishment. And here we actually have to be quite precise. If the superego is the punitive dimension of the ego ideal, which nevertheless sustains the horizon against which possibility, in which enjoyment is possible for the subject, then this means that after the death of God, after the post-ideological turn, in which one does not live for something, but simply lives for enjoyment as such, this means that the subject must create a superego in the guise or in the stead of the death of God, so as to sustain its enjoyment. Which is to say, the central argument is this: we create illusions of purpose so as to sustain our desire. Which is to say, we have to create constantly new and recurring goals or incentive structures to keep us happy. We need to find master figures who teach us how to discipline ourselves. We follow the voice on our sport apps so that we can work out at the gym, etc. And Žižek's argument is that it is against this backdrop that we emerge in a society that is both highly cynical, namely, why would I make an effort? After all, nothing means anything and I can't accomplish anything, versus the inverse of it, which is a paradoxical return or a popular desire for figures of parental authority, be it strongman political leaders or voices of parental guidance such as Jordan Peterson, etc. Now, it's important to note here that Žižek actually does have a remedy, as I said at the beginning of this video. His proposal is that psychoanalysis can actually help us escape this deadlock of enjoyment. He says, the goal of psychoanalysis is not to provide a master, but to make us understand the very structure by which we appear to need one in the first place, thereby making the problem disappear, i.e., we are both our own master and we don't even need a master. The example that I like to use here is Luffy from One Piece. When Luffy is asked why he wants to be Pirate King, he says he doesn't want to be Pirate King to be the most powerful, to lord it over others, which of course would be a weak man's conception of power. Instead, Luffy wants to be Pirate King so as to be the most free man alive. But in a sense, Luffy is thereby already Pirate King. It is just that everybody else hasn't realized it yet. Luffy is already the most free, and his life, therefore, is the process of making other people realize it. In a sense, you could say that the same is true from the stance of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis isn't trying to make you strong so as to thrive within a repressed society, nor is it trying to make you someone who is the best amongst your peers. Instead, psychoanalysis is trying to point out that the exact moment at which you realize that you are your own master, that you do not need one, you have already become free. That, in a sense, you are already the Pirate King. You just haven't realized it yet. And as soon as you realize this, it's up to other people to start realizing it as well. Now, what I'd like to finish on here is that Žižek essentially is therefore arguing that if you want to be happy, you have to find something that you dedicate your entire life to. Essentially, this is your symptom. And yet, it has to be a project that you can't, by definition, complete. A project that is infinite. For example, Žižek says that the only way that he can properly enjoy life, reading books, going to movies, etc., isn't because he likes reading books and going to movies. It's because when he reads a book or goes to a movie, he knows that he can then put it into a book. Which is to say, his philosophical project sustains his desire to get up in the morning and participate in everyday life. Everything is filtered back into the book. And here we have the Lacanian maxim that you should love your symptom like yourself. Identify the thing that gives your life structure and meaning and purpose, and then everything else becomes filtered through that very thing. But the key thing here, and I want to caution here, is that you can't simply make yourself completely subservient to it. Instead, there must always be a dimension by which what you do, your symptom, is also of service to others. Thereby, the best, if you will, symptom is one that equally serves your needs inasmuch as it serves others. Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer, has what I think is a cautionary tale of someone who falls in love with their own symptom, but it doesn't serve anybody else. He writes about a man, an old Jewish man, who sits at a cafe every day, and all he does is read. He reads catalogs, not books, but catalogs about books, over and over and over again. It's all he does. He's essentially almost a psychotic. And one day the man disappears. And years later, Stefan Zweig goes to the cafe and says, what happened to that old man? And the proprietress of the cafe says that one day, the catalog that the man was reading had a forbidden or banned book on it, which put him on a list of political suspects. He was arrested and tortured. He, of course, had no idea why he was arrested or what he was being tortured for, therefore remained in prison. Finally, they realized that he was a fool, released him, he walked back to the cafe, and promptly died. Here we have a very poetic story from Stefan Zweig about what happens when you fully psychotically give yourself to your symptom. Instead, in some way, you have to be not just the passive agent of your symptom, but also the one who shapes it, the one who is the master of it. You have to become both the agent and the master of your symptom. Therefore, identify something that you feel like it is worth dedicating your entire life towards, so that every day you can wake up in the morning looking forward to doing that thing, overcoming that hurdle. In fact, the more difficult, the better, the more impossible, the more fruitful, but make sure that it is something that also gives back to others, that also provides values to others. And if you can find the sweet spot between being the agent of your symptom, as well as doing something that provides value to others, then you are likely to be happy, then you are likely to be fulfilled. That's a simplification of Žižek's argument, but nevertheless one I think that touches upon the key points as to his philosophy and his psychoanalysis. Thank you so much for listening today. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. And if you'd like to participate in more of these lectures, if you'd like to download them and read my ebooks, please do consider becoming a patron, as that allows me to keep making these videos my own symptom, as it were. See you tomorrow.